What can the deep past of Ukrainian lands reveal about the global story of humanity? 6,000 years ago, megasites flourished in what is now central Ukraine. But can these be considered the world's first cities? How were they organized without central authorities, and how do they challenge everything we thought we knew about early social life? This is Thinking in Dark Times, a podcast by UkraineWorld, an English-language multimedia project about Ukraine. I'm your host, Volodymyr Yermolenko, a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is David Wengrow, a renowned British archaeologist and professor of comparative archaeology at University College London. He is the co-author, alongside David Graeber, of the international bestseller The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. Thinking in Dark Times is produced by UkraineWorld and brought to you by Internet Ukraine. Before we dive into the conversation, a brief reminder: you can support our independent journalism via Patreon. Your contributions are vital, as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also support our volunteer missions to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we provide direct aid to civilians and defenders. Donations are welcome via PayPal. All relevant links are available in the episode description. Now, let's begin. David Wengrow, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for agreeing to talk. So I want to talk with you about this book that you co-written with David Graeber, which is called The Dawn of Everything. And this is a remarkable book, I think, which tries to rethink many concepts about what human societies are. Can you tell me a little bit in a more general terms about this book, why you've written it, and what is your major argument?
Yeah, sure. The full title of the book in English is The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. And if I may say, it's just been translated into Ukrainian by the Kyiv-based publisher Bookchef. I'm very proud that at a time of war, when Russian forces are destroying Ukrainian books, we have a small part in creating a new one. And I know that my co-author, David Graeber, would have been very excited about this Ukrainian translation of our work. So I look forward to its release in the very near future, and I'm grateful to our Ukrainian publisher for this achievement. Ukraine features in the book in connection with one of its major themes, which is the scaling up of human societies to urban proportions, or what's always been referred to as the urban revolution in human history. And this is one of a number of key thresholds in human history that we try to rethink in this book, including the earlier origins of agriculture and the later origins of the state. And we do this using the latest findings in our fields. The late David Graeber was a social anthropologist. I am an archaeologist, mainly of Western Eurasia. And we really wrote the book partly out of a sense that most of these new discoveries of, let's say, the last 30 or 40 years in Ukraine, but also everywhere else in the world, have really not found their way into people's general understandings of the overall course, the overall story of the history of our species. So at a very simple level, it's an attempt to bring ourselves and our readers up to date with this emerging new picture of what most of the human past was really like, which turns out to be nothing like the standard narratives that we find in other books and on school curricula and in higher education.
That's very interesting, and very interesting that you wrote this book with David Graeber. Tragically, he passed away a few years ago. The interesting part, of course, is the way how you struggle, you fight against these narratives that we were just communities, small communities, and then humanity invented agriculture, and then there was the division of products, of surpluses, and then the division of labor, and then emergence of power and hierarchy, which of course we also learn we were learning in Soviet Union and in post-Soviet schools, because it was kind of a part of the Marxist Vulgata. In which way your argument is different from that?
Well, the old orthodox Marxian version of the story is exactly as you told it. Was originally, of course, a story of liberation, which ended with the proletariat achieving self-consciousness after the various dialectical shifts between feudalism, capitalism, and so on. These days, it seems to me that what's happened is we get the first part of Marx and Engels' story, from the origins of agriculture and this kind of fall from primitive hunter-gatherer innocence through to the rise of capitalism, but then nothing happens afterwards. In other words, the final liberation is just sort of chopped off the end. And what we're told in books like the famous one by Harari, or the work of Jared Diamond or Steven Pinker, is that basically what we have now at this particular moment is the end point of human history. So actually what started out as a narrative about freedom turns out to be a story about the impossibility of any real social change. What we argue is that actually what was taught on classic Marxist and socialist curricula actually is a story with very conservative origins. I think it's no accident that it has morphed into a very conservative reactionary story, because before Marx and Engels turned their minds to it, that's exactly how it originated earlier on in the European Enlightenment. We argue in The Dawn of Everything actually is a counter-narrative, a backlash against something we call the indigenous critique of Western civilization. And this was a radical critique of the inequalities and unfairness and violence of European societies, which was launched from many different quarters, but the one that we focus on are the indigenous peoples of North America at the time of colonization by the French. And these critiques of European society were spreading like wildfire in the intellectual circles of Western Europe just a few decades before the French Revolution. And the counter-narrative, which was designed to neutralize them, is precisely the one about how all humans lived in these materially very equal and simple societies until the rise of agriculture made private property and inequality inevitable. And that is the story we've largely ended up with. As it happens, almost nothing about that story is true.
I really like this argument that Marx and Engels' theory were based upon conservative and even reactionary theories, because I consider it from the another point of view when I analyze the philosophy of history by Marx, because basically the idea that history proceeds as a cycle of catastrophes and revolutions and radical shifts was initially a conservative idea, implemented, basically created by the opponents of the French Revolution, who were trying to say that the French Revolution was the radical change. But here we come to the Ukrainian part of your story, which I'm very interested in, and I can tell you, and I can tell to our listeners, that we already touched upon this a little bit, the archaeological depth of cultures that were on the current Ukrainian territory in our podcast with Timothy Snyder recently, where we talked about history. And for our listeners, I would like to say that he touches upon this, but it's very, very interesting how Snyder, for example, who was initially historian of modern times and 20th century, turns to these very deep layers to understand what is going on. So basically what you are talking about in your book is the culture that was developing in the territory of the current Ukraine and Moldova, and basically maybe the broader Black Sea region 6,000 years ago. And we call it Cucuteni-Trypillia culture. It is a culture that we know from the archaeological investigations. And you're talking about some megasites or proto-cities. Can you tell me a little bit about this?
Yes. I would start by just noting that there was a time lag in the recognition of these enormous archaeological sites. They were first brought to light at their full scale in the 1970s through really very pioneering work by Ukrainian archaeologists using survey techniques from the air and also prospection below the ground. But the Cold War meant that Western scholars remained largely ignorant of these important findings. This was really beginning to change quite rapidly before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There were international teams active in the region east of the city of Uman, including a team from the UK in collaboration with Ukrainian colleagues. And what they were finding, I would say, really obliges us to rethink the course of human history in a number of important ways. And these have particularly to do with urbanization and understanding the roots of urban life in Eurasia. Actually, the so-called megasites of Ukraine occupy a key place in our changing picture of world history, which is enriched by discoveries in other parts of the world. So it used to be thought that the first cities in Western Eurasia emerged in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, or what today are the countries of Iraq and Syria, and that urban life marked the beginning of humanity's journey from living in these simple, small-scale societies to living in states, which are the distant ancestors of the kind of societies we live in today, densely inhabited, bureaucratically organized, and divided along lines of social rank and class, with wealthy elites living off the surplus labor of their subordinates, etc., the whole old Marxian story that you referred to. This is also what the Australian archaeologist V. Gordon Childe, who was a very committed Marxist, called the urban revolution. And he had in mind the kind of societies that emerged in the Middle East, including in ancient Egypt with its great pyramid tombs and pharaoh kings. And all of this is supposed to have happened around 5,000 years ago. Now, today we can see that the picture is very different and much more interesting, not just in Eurasia, but actually around the whole world. We now have evidence to show that cities already existed in China on the lower reaches of the Yellow River more than 1,000 years before the first known royal dynasty. Or if we look on the other side of the Pacific to Peru, we now have cities appearing more than 4,000 years before the Inca Empire. Now, we can't say very much yet about how these cities functioned, but they existed. Amazonia, the Maya lowlands of Mexico, also now are producing evidence of urban life that is much earlier and more complex than previously suspected. And then if we come back to Eurasia, we also have early cities of the Indus Valley in what today is Pakistan, which have been known about for over a century, but still present no compelling evidence for things like kings or ruling elites. So our picture of this whole crucial threshold in the history of human societies, the origin of cities and urban life, is rapidly changing, and that is the context in which these Ukrainian sites, which are located in the countryside between the Bug and the Dnieper rivers, have taken on such great significance.
So it's a very interesting region in Ukraine, actually, because you mentioned the city of Uman. Uman is a well-known city for Hasidim culture, for the Jewish culture, and a site of pilgrimage of Hasidim. And of course, it's also the land of the Cossacks in the early modern times. And we just returned, by the way, from our trip to Kherson, which is a frontline city, very endangered by the Russian attacks. And we were crossing these territories as well, which I love very much, frankly speaking. These are my lands. My family comes not very far away from it. So you mentioned several sites, Nebelivka, Majdaneckie, and Talyanki. And your argument is that, if I get it right, that these were cities. They were not built in stone, but rather built from the organic materials, and therefore they're not preserved right now, contrary to Mesopotamian cities. And
well, I think maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in English we call the way they built houses wattle and daub. I think it's mazanka or mazanka.
yeah, and it's very it's also very interesting how it basically went into Ukrainian traditional house building, because the peasants have been building such type of houses until the 20th century, and sometimes in the Ukrainian countryside you can see these types of houses which are, as you describe it in your book, which are very warm inside when it is cold outside, and which are relatively cool and cold when it is warm outside. But you also describe these cities as very egalitarian. So you say that there are no sign of administrative buildings, no sign of any kind of hierarchy. Can you explain and develop on that?
Well, if we start with the description of these sites as cities, this is not uncontroversial. I believe we can call them, if you like, jointly the first cities on Earth. So the megasites begin to take form on the Ukrainian grasslands around 6,000 years ago. That's roughly the same time that the first cities begin to appear in the Middle East. And when archaeologists talk about cities at this time, they mean human settlements which are orders of magnitude larger than their Neolithic predecessors. So in the Middle East, this refers to sites of around 200 hectares, which is about 2 square kilometers, populations in the tens of thousands. Usually there's evidence for some kind of central acropolis, monumental architecture, temples, and so on. The Ukrainian megasites develop at roughly the same time, around 6,000 years ago. They're all located on the open grasslands north of the Black Sea. More than 10 of these massive sites are documented. Maybe others lie buried under modern towns and cities, including Uman. The people who lived in them didn't use writing, so we have no idea what languages they spoke. We don't know what the cities were originally called, which is why today archaeologists tend to use the names of villages or other settlements nearby, like the ones you mentioned, Maidanetska, Talyanki, Dobrovody, and so on. We know that some of them were as large or even larger than the earliest cities in the Middle East, and I think there are two things about this which are important to note before we even get on to the question of social structure or to what extent they were hierarchical or egalitarian. First of all, the mere existence of these sites changes our whole understanding of the Ukrainian grasslands in world history. As you know, since the time of the ancient Greeks, Herodotus, this region was the barbarian steppe. This was a land of nomadic, warlike tribes, rich kurgan tombs stuffed with golden treasure, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, these peoples who formed part of the great waves of human migration that crossed from Central Asia to the Pontic steppe and the area north of the Black Sea. So today we know that actually long before all of this happened, there were also cities, and their remains are buried deep under those Chornozem soils of the Ukrainian steppe, about 1 meter below the surface of the earth. And as we can discuss, these cities do, in my opinion, present a very egalitarian picture of urban life 3,000 years before the birth of democracy in ancient Greece. So potentially we have an interesting reversal of human political history, not just demography. The second thing I would point out is that the identification of these cities has been, as I said, controversial. Actually, I completed an exhibition project about 2 years ago with the London-based organization called Forensic Architecture, which was intended to explore this controversy in the context of other work they've been doing on human rights in Ukraine and elsewhere. That exhibition is called the Nebelivka Hypothesis, named after Nebelivka, another of these megasites. And it has actually, you mentioned Timothy Snyder, it's now been incorporated into the Ukrainian History Global Initiative, which Snyder is involved with, where it's being taken forward by our colleague Maxim Rokmaniko of the Center for Spatial Technologies in Kyiv. So, what is the source of the controversy? Why do we call these early Ukrainian sites megasites rather than just cities or urban sites? This has to do with their lack of conformity to theoretical models of early urban life, which assume the presence of hierarchy, class divisions, and centralized control as core features of the city at its point of origination. And it's this absence of hierarchy in the Ukrainian case that has often led scholars to use these rather euphemistic language of megasites or overgrown villages. So the Nebelivka hypothesis is partly the hypothesis that urbanization has been possible for human societies without the division of social life into rigid ranks and classes. There's also an ecological dimension which we can get onto.
That's very, very interesting. And as far as I understand, these cities, or proto cities, they were circular in their form, and it also kind of presented a kind of a vision of the world where people are living in kind of a circle, right? And
You have to picture roughly, say, 1,000 or so domestic houses of roughly equal size, arranged into several large circular formations, a bit like the rings of a tree trunk, around an empty center, covering an area which, for comparison, was roughly the size of London in the medieval period. Now, there's no clear evidence of the things you mentioned before, like central administration or palaces or rich burials or any of these other indicators of inequality that were long considered to be typical of early cities. Nor is there any clear evidence so far of warfare or systems of fortifications around the megasites. Actually, what the archaeology shows in each case is a system of neighborhoods, and every neighborhood is associated with a single larger structure that appears to have served as an assembly hall for making decisions collectively. So what's being reconstructed by archaeologists like Bissaka, Gajdarska, John Chapman, Johannes Müller, who've worked at these sites, is a form of urban life based on self-governing districts with no compelling evidence for a political or religious ruling class and little sign of conflict. Now, I should add these interpretations by international scholars are not universally agreed on, including by some of their Ukrainian colleagues. All I can say is that I've personally not seen anything that convinces me that there was some kind of great king or ruler holding court in these settlements. Actually, as you said before, the Ukrainian megasites are an outgrowth of what prehistorians call the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, which had a much larger distribution through Moldova and the Carpathian Mountains into Romania. And this was originally a culture of mostly small villages, which only scaled up to urban dimensions when its creators came to settle on the Ukrainian steppe. But in doing so, they retained certain traditions of art and ritual that began in the villages, including the production of sometimes quite beautiful painted ceramics, figurines, and other household crafts. We also have detailed studies of the economy of the megasites, which shows mostly small-scale garden cultivation of cereal crops, combined with keeping livestock, tending orchards, and then a very wide spectrum of hunting and foraging activity. So this is a very diverse urban economy, which supported the existence of the megasites at this large scale for about 800 years. Actually, it's remarkable how these early cities or proto-cities actually leave a very light ecological footprint in the landscape. And this has been tested by putting deep cores into the earth around the site so you can extract sequences of plant pollen that show us what the surrounding vegetation was like in ancient times. Actually, there's an even more intriguing claim at the moment about the environment of these ancient sites, which we also explored in our exhibition. The claim originates not at Nebelivka itself, but through the work of Ukrainian archaeologists and scientists from the University of Kiel in Germany at the site of Majdanetske. And their suggestion, based on evidence from that site, is that these giant human settlements were not just very sustainable, but actually enhanced the process of soil formation on the steppe. In other words, the famously rich black soils, or chornozem, which Snyder has written about so eloquently, may in fact be at least partly anthropogenic. that is, humanly produced soils as a result of ancient cities interacting with nature. Now, this is quite an audacious claim. It's not, in fact, an entirely new hypothesis, but the Ukrainian megasites have given it a new dimension, if you like.
That's very interesting because it really sounds very Ukrainian. If we understand the Ukrainian political culture, at least part of it as very grassroots and where self-organization plays a big role, where there is always a mistrust to the central government, where there is a certain anarchism, but in a good sense of the term, meaning some kind of grassroots democracy. And it's really tells us a lot about this certain continuity of what was happening here in the northern Black Sea, because as you told us, we know about this region from Herodotus, from the Greeks, from the Greek myths, from the myths about Amazons or Hyperboreans. But there is probably something even more interesting to learn about. So you mentioned ancient Greek cities, which people consider to be the origins of democracy, and this idea of polis as people gathering together and going beyond families. This is how Aristotle describes is how polis is basically constructed. So do you think we can say that prior to these ancient Greek policies, we have kind of a democratic or proto-democratic or anarchic or polyarchic, if you can use this term, cities like those in Ukraine or probably other parts of the world?
Yeah, I do. And I think we have to break down this concept of democracy and try to be consistent in its application. So when we talk about ancient Greek democracy, it's very important to remember that with the polis in ancient Greece, we're talking about a slave society, right? We're talking about a society in which a large part of the resident population of the city are chattel slaves, completely disenfranchised, and in which women are excluded from any kind of public political process. We're also not talking about a form of democracy like our modern one, which is based on elections. In fact, the ancient Greek democracies preferred sortition or random lottery as a way of selecting magistrates and other important political figures. So I think we have to start by defamiliarizing slightly this idea, rather idealized notion of ancient Greek democracy and leveling the playing field. If we then think about democracy in broader terms, more like what you were saying before, really, about self-organization, people collectively making decisions together without the use of organized coercion, so what we might just call participatory democracy, I think something of that nature has been reconstructed for the Ukrainian megasites, and I certainly find it the most compelling way to look at them.
Yes, and coming back also to this philosophical side of it, I really like the way how you, with David Graeber, how you basically are arguing against the major figures that help us to understand the human society, like Thomas Hobbes or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and you argue that both of them are wrong, because basically if you look at these proto-cities, you understand that the idea that initially people are hating each other, or people are enemies to each other, or there is a war of all against all, like in a Hobbesian view, is wrong. And probably also even the Rousseauist view that we were okay, we were very good as a people of nature.
Yeah, I mean, they're basically the same story, but Rousseau starts with a kind of fall from grace, and then you end up with civilization and inequality, whereas Hobbes starts with brutish sort of competition and ruthless inequality, and then it gets kind of slightly tamed by civilization. But you always end up in both stories with this notion that really quite brutal inequalities are the kind of necessary price of inequality, of civilization.
Yes, exactly. And this leads me to the next question. So how these archaeological findings help us and help you better understand the nature of human societies? In your book, you're telling the story how it is wrong to believe that people are rather tend to be equal in a small communities, like the family communities. And here I agree with you totally, because I think this is also an idea of, even if we criticize this idea of polis and ancient Greek cities, but we see in this idea that when you are in the family structure, which is tribal structure, you always have kind of a hierarchy, patriarch, etc. But when you go to the city, idea of the city where there is several thousands of people, you need to negotiate. You cannot just rule from above. Is it the way you argue? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really back to front. I mean, most people sort of common sense idea that there's something about very small scale groups that lends itself to an egalitarian existence. When you think about it for a moment, it actually runs contrary to everything we know and experience. I mean, it's almost impossible ethnographically, anthropologically, to find examples of egalitarian households or family structures. As you say, there are always elementary divisions of people along gender lines, the old and the young. This idea that small scale equals egalitarian, I think, is one of the more sort of basic things we need to rethink, how inequality actually emerges from below through family structures. And in fact, the standard narrative of human history basically denies that sites like Nebelivka can exist or be considered cities, because to call them cities would mean rewriting the whole story, especially on the topics of urbanism and the origins of the state, because we're told time and again that extreme inequality is the necessary handmaiden of civilization, or that complexity in human societies has to come as a sort of package, together with great rulers and warfare and oligarchs trampling everyone underfoot. Actually, the Ukrainian megasites present us with a different form of human social complexity and the beginnings of a different narrative. So we have to start thinking about how, for hundreds of years, the inhabitants of these sites seem to have very carefully balanced the rhythms of cultivation and harvesting and herding, foraging, hunting, between the forest and the steppe. How did they coordinate the movements of stone and salt, timber, copper, pigments over very long distances, which we've shown they did? How did they develop these sophisticated domestic arts and crafts? And you could even contrast this rather fluid system of urban life with the kind of very heavy, top-down, highly extractive urban systems that did develop in Mesopotamia and were often driven by the needs of centralized taxation. And interestingly, those also produce a kind of radically simplified and standardized form of domestic life. The Ukrainian megasites are really fun at the domestic level. It's almost like a sort of massive artists' colony in which every household is producing its own crockery and performing its own rituals. So I think we have to start considering the possibility that there have existed in human history complex and large-scale forms of human social life, which also conserve the life-giving forces of the environment, using less, preserving more, or which even amplify the vitality of the land they inhabit. But above all, to me, I think what the Ukrainian megasites represent is that there is no strong or necessary causal relationship between an increase in scale and an increase in hierarchy in human societies. And this in itself, I think, is a really important insight, and it puts the development of cities in other parts of the world in a different light. It kind of changes the benchmark or the threshold from which we look at such processes.
Indeed, it's very interesting and really one of the most powerful arguments of the book. You mentioned the ceramics and pottery. It's interesting. I mentioned already how these Trypillian forms of building houses preserved through thousands of years in Ukraine, in Ukrainian countryside. We can also say about the pottery and ceramics, because we are now in a kind of a revival of this. People are very, very interested in this again, and people are very interested in this symbolics of the Trypillian or Cucuteni-Trypillian culture. And basically, it's interesting how how these elements of self-organization element or anarchic element or grassroots element, again, I use the term anarchic in a positive sense here, just for our listeners, as a kind of absence of one top arche, meaning one top power institution. But it's also interesting how sometimes the anarchist view from the outside on Ukraine, on Ukrainian history, is filled with misunderstanding, because how sometimes the anarchist thinking or leftist thinking in general misreads what is happening in these parts of the world with regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, etc. How there is a tendency to look at as a kind of a top-down something, or NATO or conspiracy or whatever, while what is the most interesting is how Ukrainians organize themselves to resist this Russian invasion. And this leads me to a more kind of philosophical question, but I will ask it at the end. First, let me ask you, what is still missing in the picture? What is still a mystery for you? What would you like to learn from the kind of archaeological investigations in the future about the Ukrainian cities or any other cities in the world?
Oh, well, there are so many things. I mean, in many ways, the picture we have of the ancient Ukrainian megasites is only just starting to take form. There are at least two major features of their existence that come to my mind, which remain very enigmatic, and I personally would love to know more about them. The first one concerns the very strange, deliberate burning of domestic dwellings. So, as we talked about, the houses in the megasites were quite robust. They were built in this mazanka method, wattle and daub, as we call it in English, on stone foundations. There were fixed installations, kilns, that sort of thing. But it's also very clear that a significant number of these houses were deliberately incinerated by their inhabitants, burnt to the ground in this highly controlled, probably ritualized way, not as an outcome of warfare or invasion. Archaeologists are very clear on this point. They point out, for example, that each burnt house was meticulously cleaned before it was set on fire, so there's no signs of anyone leaving in a hurry or being trapped or violence. They don't even find a trace of a house mouse, trapped inside a burning building. So this seems to be a kind of cleansing ritual, which was also perhaps a ritual of closing the house. And practices of that sort are actually much more widely documented in the Neolithic societies of the whole region and into the Balkans. I would like to know more about that, and also what it means for this whole question of whether people lived all the year round in these huge settlements, and for how much of the year. I'd also like to know much more about why the megasites eventually did come to an end, to be replaced by these much more mobile forms of human society, which were smaller in scale and, interestingly, more violent and apparently more hierarchical. There are various hypotheses about this, including some kind of plague or pestilence, but none of them actually seem very convincing to me at the moment. So we still have a lot to learn about this whole civilization.
Absolutely. And this is also a question that I ask myself. So what happened to them? What happened to this civilization that developed 6,000 years ago? And as you said, that that subsisted for 800 years. So what happened to this? But do I understand you correctly that you argue that the next form of human societies, which were not agricultural, but rather warrior-like, and the military and maybe nomadic emerged, and they built the cities, the new type of cities. They built the armies, they built the state as we know it, and hierarchies and power structures that were initially military power structures that basically destroyed this initial egalitarian agricultural civilizations. Is that what you're arguing?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the growth of truly extractive societies which produce far less than they consume, and in which raiding does play a very important role, and also slavery. I wouldn't go so far, for example, as the earlier writer Maria Gimbutas, who was a major figure in Indo-European studies and prehistory. She argued for something exactly like what you've just described, where she had this, I guess most would feel, rather idealized vision of what she called Old Europe, which was this agrarian, very peaceful, equal gender roles civilization that was basically wiped out by these floods of patriarchal, horse riding, warrior like nomads. I think what we see now concretely, in some ways, does bear out what she was saying. But there's a very long transitional phase before you get to anything like a cavalry or an army, or indeed a new form of urban life in the region.
Yeah, because it's very, very interesting. And, I will just share my very kind of a personal and not very scientific observations. When I'm, as a Ukrainian, come to the Western Europe, right, I see cities built from stone. And I'm asking myself, why don't we have so many cities like that in Ukraine? My first hypothesis was that, look, but in Ukraine, you don't have a lot of stone. You have Chernozem, you have this beautiful grasslands and everything. But then I went to Podilla last year. And in Podilla, it's for our listeners, it's, for example, the cities like Kamenets-Podilsky, and it's the river Dniester. So it's also not very far away from the sites that you're describing. And there are also sites of Cucuteni-Trypillia culture there. So there is a lot of stone there. So you can basically build a lot of fortresses. And they were built in the modern times. There are lots of fortresses there. But still, people were building these mazankas in like 6,000 years ago. So probably the answer to this question is not availability or non-availability of stones. It's something else. And while I really admire this picture that you describe of this egalitarian sites, at the same time I understand that when an army comes to them and wants to destroy them, they're kind of defenseless because they do not develop this warrior class or whatever. Which is a sad story about the Ukrainian history in a way, because the Ukrainian history was always tending to be this more agricultural, peaceful, people, and then when invaders come, we are sometimes feel unprotected and defenseless, and now we are living in a kind of a new situation of that, and we are trying to build the army from the scratch, and our army is also very grassroots. And sometimes I give this metaphor that Russia builds a society like an army or a prison, and Ukrainians build an army like a society. So it's also the exchange of the roles. But at the same time, when and it's kind of this portion of critique of your argument, which I admire and very interested. But don't we kind of when we think about civilization, isn't it also a combination between the two? It's sometimes the combination between egalitarian and hierarchical? Because again, when we look at the Ukrainian history, we go to the medieval times, we go to this concept of Rus, and we understand that there is something, you probably know that the start of the dynasties in Kiev were Scandinavian, and Scandinavians were precisely these warrior societies that came here and probably jumped into the more or less the same egalitarian agricultural societies and built a state. And this state was, of course, not egalitarian, but it was able to defend itself from the foreign invaders until a certain point. What are your thoughts about this?
I don't actually see any sort of particular critique of our arguments in what you're saying. I think this really comes down to calling a horse, if you like. I mean, the standard narrative tells you that the more hierarchical, more violent elements, the sort of Darwinian kind of factors that you're talking about, which are, of course, undeniably real and catastrophic, the standard narrative of human history sublimates them. It doesn't call them by their name. It says, well, this is all a kind of necessary side effect of other things. like the invention of agriculture, for example, or the growth of cities, things that actually could have a whole range of other consequences. In other words, it's as if violence of the sort that you're talking about were the kind of necessary substratum of civilization. And I think, this is where we end up stuck in our rather sort of cyclical view of human history, where we can't envisage any other kind of trajectory. So it's not a matter of denying the brute realities of warfare and invasion, and sometimes the vulnerability of societies that don't organize in that way. I think on the contrary, it's about calling them out. It's about calling them what they are, and not sort of wrapping them in confetti and pretending they're about something else, let alone some sort of idea of civilization. And then dealing with them, and where appropriate, attempting some kind of process of truth-telling and reconciliation. I don't know. So you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
It's about confronting the violence as violence, and not sublimating it. The other point I'd make. Sorry, did you want to comment?
No. Go ahead.
Just when you were talking about stone architecture, coming back to my late co-author, David Graeber, it reminded me very strongly. He did all his anthropological fieldwork on the island of Madagascar, which famously has an island-wide taboo on building stone houses to live in. Domestic houses are not meant to be built of stone. And David rather liked this argument that actually this began sometime around the 10th century AD, when the northern part of Madagascar began to be incorporated into the wider sphere of Indian Ocean trade, Muslim traders arriving, slavers, and one of the first things they do when they start building port cities on the north coast of Madagascar is putting up these huge stone buildings, these great mansion houses, forts, fortifications, and so on. So he rather liked the idea that there was a kind of conscious rejection, kind of schismogenesis, which went the other way and sort of seeped deep into the kind of fabric of Malagasy society, which rejected stone architecture for the living, but embraced it for the dead. So you get these very impressive megalithic stone tombs, but you don't get the application of stone to houses that people actually live in.
Yeah, because when you think about the dead, you think about some kind of eternity, and when you are in a society, in a human society, which is very embedded into the land, for example, and the natural processes you mentioned, this burning of the houses, it's probably the ritual that. And by the way, there are relics of this ritual in Ukraine, which are of course related to the harvest and how you burn the remnants of the harvest, and this circular vision of life, circular vision of the nature. But sometimes, for you to understand my feelings, sometimes I envy people in the Western Europe, for example, that have this stone architecture that lives for ages. When I go to Athens, when I climb the Acropolis, and I see how basically culture is also about preserving something, and you preserve something when you have it also in stones, because this is the point that you mentioned initially, that we only can grasp something that existed here 6,000 years ago from archaeology. We don't have the actual, even the ruins of these places. But that's all very interesting.
Yeah, but I think I'm increasingly convinced that this kind of monumental way of memorializing human culture and human societies, there's always a human price behind that. I mean, I think memory, in general, our memories it's almost like there's a sort of limited economy. I hate that term, but like there's a certain amount of it in the world. And when you get the construction of great monuments, the Acropolis, pyramids, temples, whatever, there's always some other group of people who can't do that, who can't connect with their ancestors. It gets sucked up into a sort of high center. I'm afraid I'm not expressing this very clearly.
No, I understand you very well.
Perhaps
Yeah,
you see what I mean.
yeah, of course.
I think the one of the interesting things that we're learning now, partly as a result of new techniques in archaeology, is how to detect these much softer traces of civilization in the ancient landscape, whether it's using, these are all decommissioned military technologies, by the way, like LiDAR or corona satellite imagery, which just allow you to sort of peer very gently under the forest canopy or under the ground without doing this kind of heavy invasive excavation that used to be very typical of archaeology. And we're seeing these much sort of gentler traces in the landscape, which I think have their own charm and in their way are just as impressive.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the problems of this stone because, the stone memorials are only possible when you can force thousands of people to contribute to that against their will, and sometimes they're very, very dramatic and tragic. But thank you very much for this amazing conversation. I really loved it, and it shows how interesting the history of humanity is. It shows how interesting the correlation between the egalitarian and hierarchical elements of these are, and how history of Ukraine is interesting in this point, not only for the sake of the Ukrainian history, but for the sake of the history of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me on.
This was a podcast Thinking in Dark Times by UkraineWorld, an English language media outlet about Ukraine. I'm your host, Volodymyr Yermolenko, a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was David Wengrow, a renowned British archaeologist and professor of comparative archaeology at University College London. He is the co-author, alongside David Graeber, of the international bestseller The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. Let me remind you that you can support our independent journalism via Patreon. Your contributions are vital as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also support our volunteer missions to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we provide direct aid to civilians and defenders. Donations are welcome via PayPal. All relevant links are available in the episode description. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.